Nora Jean Calloway was 10 years old the morning she pulled a threadbare quilt up over her mother's still face, took her 6-year-old sister by the hand, and walked out into the blinding Wyoming sun with nothing but a flour sack and a direction. West. Toward smoke rising on the horizon. Toward a stranger whose name she didn't know. She didn't know his grief. She didn't know his story. She only knew her sister was hungry. Her mother was gone, and standing still meant dying. Before I tell you what happened at that stranger's door, if this story moves you, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far these two little girls travel. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button now and stay with me until the very end. Because what this cowboy did next will stay with you long after the last word. Now let me tell you about the day a broken man opened his door and found the one thing he never thought he needed again. The quilt had been their mother's wedding gift. Hand-stitched by a grandmother Nora had never met, patched and repatched across 12 years of hard winters and harder times. Now it lay pulled up to Margaret Calloway's chin, covering the gray stillness of a face that had once been the most beautiful thing in Nora's world. She stood beside the narrow bed for a long time, long enough for the morning light to shift from pale gold to the hard white of full sunrise. Long enough for the silence in the cabin to become a living thing, pressing against her ears and her chest and the back of her throat. "Nora!" Rosie's voice came from behind her, small and thick with sleep. "Is Mama still tired?" Nora didn't turn around right away. She needed one more second, just one. "Come here, Rosie May." She turned and crouched down so they were eye to eye the way Mama had always done when she had something hard to say. Rosie stood in the doorway in her nightgown, her blonde curls wild from sleep, her rag doll pressed against her chest. 6 years old and still believing in things like tomorrow and safe and Mama's coming back. "Is she better?" Rosie asked. Her lower lip had already begun to tremble the way it always did right before she understood something she didn't want to understand. "She's at rest now, baby." Nora reached out and smoothed a curl from Rosie's forehead. "She went to be with Papa." The silence that followed was the kind that breaks children. "But she promised." Rosie's voice cracked down the middle. "She promised she wouldn't leave like Papa did. She promised Nora." "I know she did." "She lied." "She didn't lie." Nora pulled her sister close, pressing Rosie's face into her shoulder, feeling the small body shake against hers. "She fought as long as she could. That's not the same as lying." Rosie cried. Nora held her and stared at the wall and did not cry because she couldn't afford to. Not yet. Not when there was no one else in the world to hold them both up. Their mother had been sick for 4 months. The consumption had started as a cough that wouldn't leave and had ended as something that hollowed her out from the inside, stealing her breath and her color. And finally, in the blue-gray hour before sunrise, the last faint flutter of her pulse. Nora had been awake when it happened, had been sitting in the chair beside the bed holding her mother's hand, feeling the grip loosen and loosen until there was nothing left to hold. She'd sat there for 2 more hours before she could make herself stand up. The cabin belonged to the Copper Creek Mining Company. Her father, Thomas Calloway, had died in a shaft collapse 14 months ago, and the company had let them stay on out of some thin courtesy that Nora had always understood would eventually run out. It would run out now. They'd come for the cabin as soon as word reached them, and word traveled fast in a camp this small. The cupboard held half a tin of cornmeal, a pinch of salt, and nothing else. Nora went to the corner where their few possessions were stored in a wooden crate. She pulled out the flour sack she'd already decided to use, had already decided in the long, quiet hours of the night when she'd understood that mourning would require action rather than grief. Her mother's journal of remedies and recipes. A tintype photograph from her parents' wedding day. Rosie's spare dress. The small bundle of cloth that held her mother's wedding ring, and the silver locket that had belonged to their grandmother. A shawl that still smelled faintly of the lavender her mother had always kept drying by the window. "Where are we going?" Rosie had stopped crying, but her voice was still raw. "To find help." "Who's going to help us? Mr. Dalton said we were a burden. Mrs. Pruitt said Mama should have thought about us before she got sick." Rosie's face darkened with a child's clear-eyed fury. I don't want to go to them. We're not going to them. Nora tied the sack closed and swung it over her shoulder. I saw smoke yesterday from the ridge, west of here. Someone's got a fire going, which means someone's got a house, and maybe they've got enough heart left in them to help two girls who need it. What if they don't? Nora looked at her sister. She thought about lying, thought about promising it would be fine the way Mama had promised things she couldn't guarantee. Then we'll figure out the next thing after that, she said instead. Put your shoes on. The Wyoming sun hit them like a flat hand the moment they stepped outside. It was barely past dawn, and already the heat was building, radiating up off the dirt road and pressing down from a sky that offered no mercy. Nora looked back once at the cabin, at the oilcloth window, at the door hanging slightly crooked on its hinges, at the place where her whole life had been contained for as long as she could remember. She didn't say goodbye out loud. She set it in the place behind her ribs where she kept the things she couldn't afford to feel yet, and then she took Rosie's hand and turned west. They walked for what felt like forever and was probably 2 hours. Nora rationed the water skin carefully, allowing Rosie small sips when her sister's steps began to drag. The road was rutted and dusty and offered no shade. Rosie stopped complaining about her feet after the first mile, which was worse than complaining because it meant she was past the point of expecting relief. I see something, Rosie said, and her voice had gone very quiet. Nora looked up. Over the crest of the long slope ahead she could see it. A column of smoke rising steady and straight against the blue sky. And below it, as they crested the rise, a ranch house. 2 stories, timber and stone, with a barn and several outbuildings and fences marking off green pastures where cattle grazed. The glint of water from a creek or spring catching the sun. Something in Nora's chest unclenched for the first time in hours. Maybe weeks. Someone lives there, she said. Do you think they're nice? She didn't answer that. She didn't know. They were perhaps 50 yards from the house when a man came out of the barn. He was tall, lean in the way of men who worked themselves hard and fed themselves last, with dark hair that needed cutting, and a face that might have been handsome before life had set it in such hard lines. He wore work clothes, worn at the heel boots, a faded blue shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow. He moved with the economy of someone who'd learned not to waste a single motion. He saw them immediately, stopped, stared. Nora's courage tried to leave her body entirely. She held on to it by the scruff of its neck and kept walking. Please, she called out. Her voice cracked on the word. Please, mister, we need help. The man didn't move for a long moment. His expression was unreadable at that distance, and Nora's stomach turned over as she waited to see which kind of man he was. The kind who turned away, or the other kind. Then he started walking toward them. He got close enough that she could see his face clearly, and what she saw there made her breath catch. Not anger, not the suspicion she'd prepared herself for. Something quieter. Recognition, almost. Like he'd seen something like grief before and knew exactly what it looked like wearing a child's face. What happened? His voice was rough from disuse. Where are your folks? They're gone. Nora kept her voice flat. Flat was the only way she could say it without breaking. Mama died this morning. Papa died last year. We walked here because we saw your smoke, and we have nowhere else to go. Beside her, Rosie pressed close and said nothing. The man looked at them for a long moment. Really looked the way very few adults had ever bothered to look at them. He took in Rosie's shoes that were too small. Nora's flour sack, the way they both swayed slightly on their feet from the combination of heat and hunger and grief. You walked from the mining camp? He asked. Yes, sir. About 3 miles, I think. In this heat without water. We had a little. His jaw tightened. He came to some decision that showed only in the brief shift of his shoulders. Come inside, he said. Both of you. He turned and walked toward the house without waiting to see if they'd follow, and Nora thought that was either very confident or very kind, and she didn't know yet which one it was. She took Rosie's hand, and they followed. The inside of the house was cool after the blazing sun. The man led them to a kitchen larger than the entire cabin Nora had grown up in, with a pump sink and a real iron stove and a table that could seat 6. He pulled out chairs and gestured at them. "Sit." They sat. He worked the pump, filled 2 tin cups with water that ran clear and cold. He set them on the table and then turned to the stove where something had been simmering. "When'd you last eat?" he asked, his back to them. "Yesterday morning," Nora admitted. His shoulders went rigid, but he didn't turn around, and he didn't make her feel worse about it, which she was grateful for. He ladled stew into 2 bowls, set them on the table with thick slices of bread, pulled out 2 spoons. "Eat slow," he said. "Your stomachs won't thank you if you rush." It was venison stew, thick with potatoes and carrots, and seasoned with something herbal. It was the best thing Nora had ever tasted in her life, and she had to fight every instinct in her body to eat at the pace he'd told her to. Beside her, Rosie ate and cried at the same time, the kind of crying that didn't come from sadness anymore, but from the overwhelming relief of being fed after not knowing if you would be. The man leaned against the counter and watched them with gray-green eyes that seemed built for taking in more than they gave away. "What's your name?" he asked after a while. "Nora Jean Calloway. This is my sister Rosie." "Caleb Rourke." He paused. "This is my ranch." "You live here alone?" It was out before she could stop it. She saw him register the question, saw something move through his expression like a cloud crossing water. "Yes," he said. One word, but it weighed something. Nora looked around the kitchen the way she'd been taught not to look at people's things. But she couldn't help noticing the shelf with 2 cups in regular use and a third one smaller pushed to the back. A child-sized one. A woman's embroidered cloth folded neatly over the bread basket. A jar of dried wildflowers on the windowsill, brittle and colorless now, but placed there once by someone who'd cared about such things. "You didn't always," she said quietly. Caleb's face closed like a door slamming shut. "Eat your food," he said. Nora obeyed. She had no right to his grief. Not when he'd just given them water and bread, and a cool place to sit, when he had every reason to send them back down the road. They ate in silence after that. Rosie finished half her bowl and began to nod over the rest, her eyes blinking slower and slower. Caleb straightened. "There's a room upstairs, second door on the right. Your sister can sleep there." "Both of us?" Nora asked. "Both of you?" He turned to the sink. "We'll figure out the rest after you've rested." "We'll work to pay you back," Nora said, quickly pushing her chair back. "I can cook and clean and mend. Rosie's good with chickens. We won't be a burden, I promise." He was quiet for a moment. When he turned, his expression was something she didn't have a word for yet. "Rest first," he said. "Everything else can wait." She nodded and got Rosie to her feet, her sister leaning heavily into her side. At the foot of the stairs, she paused and looked back at him. "Thank you, Mr. Rourke." He just nodded. Short and quick, like a man who didn't know what to do with gratitude. The second door on the right opened into a room that stopped Nora's breath completely. It was a child's room. A girl's room. Painted the soft yellow of early morning light with white curtains at the window. The bed was narrow, but covered with a quilt stitched in a pattern of stars. There was a dresser with a small mirror, a washstand with a flowered basin, a rag rug on the wooden floor. And on the dresser, a porcelain doll with painted eyes and a dress made of ivory lace, placed with the careful precision of someone who'd loved the child this room had been made for. Nora felt her eyes burn. Someone had loved a little girl in this room, had painted these walls yellow because yellow was cheerful, had sewn this quilt, had set that doll just so. She guided Rosie to the bed and pulled the star quilt up over her. Her sister was asleep almost before her head settled into the pillow, one small hand still holding her rag doll. "We're safe," Nora whispered, though she wasn't entirely sure it was true. "We're safe, and we're together." She stood over her sister for a long moment. Then she turned and went back downstairs. Caleb was at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee in front of him. He looked up when she came in. "The room," Nora said. She didn't make it a question. His hands tightened around the cup. It was my daughter's. Where is she? She thought he wouldn't answer. Thought she'd gone too far. Then, in a voice scraped raw at the edges, he said, "Buried out back, along with her mother. Fever took them both, 2 years ago." The words landed like stones dropped into still water. Nora thought of her mother under that threadbare quilt. Thought of her father crushed under half a mountain with no grave marker because they'd never even gotten his body out. She thought of all the ways love could be taken from a person before they'd finished needing it. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it the way you only mean something when you know exactly what it costs. Caleb nodded once, that same sharp, quick movement. Then he stood and reached for his hat on the peg by the door. "Your mother," he said. "Someone needs to see to her." Nora's throat closed. "I know, I couldn't. I didn't have a shovel and the ground's hard and I had to get Rosie away from there before—" She stopped. "I'll go." He was already pulling the hat on. "Mining Camp East, you said?" "Yes, sir. Last cabin on the north side. There's a broken wagon wheel out front." He paused at the door and looked at her over his shoulder. "You should rest too. You look like you're running on nothing. I'll rest when you come back. I need to know." She held his gaze. "That she's not just left there." Something moved through his expression again. That same thing she didn't have a word for yet. "Lock the door behind me," he said. "Don't open it for anyone but me." Then he was gone. She did as he said, slid the bolt home. Then went to the window and watched him saddle a horse with the quick, practiced movements of a man who'd done it 10,000 times, mount up and ride east at a canter that would eat the miles. He was going to bury her mother. A stranger was going to do the thing she hadn't been able to do. The tears came then, hot and fast, and so long overdue she couldn't have stopped them if she'd tried. She let herself cry for her mother and her father and the childhood that had ended the moment she'd pulled that quilt over a still face. She let herself cry for Rosie, who'd lost everyone and didn't yet understand how permanent that was. And she let herself cry for Caleb Rourke, who'd lost his whole world and somehow still had enough of himself left to open his door to 2 strangers and tell them to eat slow. When the tears ran out, she felt hollow in the way that is actually a kind of relief. She washed her face at the kitchen pump, drank another cup of water. Then she climbed the stairs to the yellow room and lay down beside Rosie on top of the quilt, careful not to wake her. Through the curtains, the sky had begun to shade toward afternoon gold. This wasn't their home. This couldn't last. But for right now, for this one afternoon, they were fed and safe and sleeping in a real bed. She told herself it would have to be enough. She was wrong about that. It would turn out to be the beginning. She woke to hoofbeats and sat up so fast her head went sideways. Rosie slept on. The light through the curtains had gone deep amber and long. She'd slept for hours. She moved to the window and looked out to see Caleb dismounting near the barn, his movements slower than when he'd left his hat and shoulders and boots all the same color of dust. He'd ridden hard in the heat and done a hard thing at the end of it. Nora was downstairs and had coffee poured by the time he came through the door. He stopped when he saw it. Looked at the cup on the table. Looked at her standing by the stove. "I figured it was the least I could do," she said. He pulled off his hat and set it on its peg and sat down. Wrapped both hands around the cup. "It's done," he said. Marked the grave, said a few words. Nora sat down across from him. "Thank you." The words felt completely inadequate and entirely necessary. Were there words you actually said? Or was it more of a, "I said some things about a woman who fought hard for her children and deserved better than she got." He looked at her. That seemed about right. Nora's throat went tight. She looked at the table. "The mining office," Caleb continued. "I stopped there on the way back. They're clearing the cabin tomorrow." "I know." She'd known it was coming. Hadn't let herself think about it directly. "There's nothing there worth having anyway. I took what mattered. The foreman asked about you girls. I told him you'd be staying here for now." Nora looked up fast. We're not your responsibility, Mr. Rourke." "You are now." His voice was flat and matter-of-fact. The way he said everything, like statements of simple fact, required no defense. You showed up at my door half dead. That makes you my responsibility until we figure out what comes next. What does come next? He was quiet for a moment, his jaw working slightly. Then, I don't know yet. The county orphanage is 3 days' ride, and I've heard things about that place that would turn your hair white. And from what I understand, most families willing to take in one child won't take two. We don't get separated. The words came out harder than she intended, each one like a nail being driven in. Rosie and I stay together. That's not something I'll bend on, not for anyone, not for any reason. Caleb studied her across the table. A 10-year-old girl with a spine made of something harder than bone, and eyes that had already seen more than most grown women ever would. That's what I figured you'd say, he said. So we'll work it out. For now, you're here. You're fed. You're safe. That's enough to start. Why? The question burst out before she could decide whether to ask it. You don't know us. We're nothing to you. Why do this? He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he set his coffee cup down and looked at the table. My daughter was 4 years old when the fever took her, he said. Her name was Clara Jane. Her mother Ellen tried to nurse her through it and got sick herself. He paused. I was out on a cattle drive, 3 days away when the message reached me. By the time I got home, they'd both been gone for a day. The kitchen was completely silent. I couldn't save them, he said. I got there too late. That's something a man carries. He met her eyes. But you girls, you showed up at my door alive, needing help. And this time I wasn't too late. This time I can actually do something. His voice dropped. So that's why. Because I failed my own family, and I'll be damned if I fail yours. Nora stared at him. At this stranger who'd buried her mother and ridden back through the afternoon heat and was now sitting across from her with grief in his gray-green eyes and stubborn purpose in the set of his jaw. Thank you, she said very quietly, for not being too late. He nodded once. Then he stood, set his cup in the sink. Get some sleep, he said. Morning comes early on a ranch, and I expect you meant what you said about working. I meant every word of it. Good. Then we'll start tomorrow. As Nora climbed the stairs back to the yellow room where Rosie was still sleeping peacefully, she turned the shape of the day over in her mind. Everything that had been true this morning was still true. Their mother was gone. Their father was gone. They had nothing and no one and no certain future. None of that had changed, but they were not alone. And somehow, in the economy of grief that Nora had been operating under for the past 14 months, that one thing changed the weight of everything else. She lay down beside Rosie in the star-quilted bed. Through the white curtains, the sky was going dark, the first stars appearing over the Wyoming mountains. She could hear the cattle settling in the pasture. Somewhere below, the sounds of Caleb moving through the house, checking the locks, banking the fire for the night. She thought about what he'd said, about arriving too late, about a little girl named Clara Jane and a woman named Ellen, and a fever that had taken them both while he was 3 days away, and riding as hard as he could. She thought about her mother's last coherent words, spoken 3 days ago, when she'd still been able to form sentences. Take care of your sister Nora Jean. Take care of Rosie May. Promise me. I promise, Mama. I promise. She'd kept that promise so far. Rosie murmured something in her sleep and reached out her small hand, closing around Nora's wrist in the instinctive way she always had, even as a baby, needing to feel that her sister was there. Nora covered that hand with her own. Outside, the wind moved through the sage in long, slow waves, and the night settled over the ranch, the way nights settled in Wyoming, vast and quiet and indifferent to everything underneath it. But inside the yellow room, with her sister's hand warm in hers, and the sound of a grieving man moving quietly through the house below to make sure they were safe, Nora Jean Calloway let herself believe for the first time in a very long time that the story wasn't over yet. She just didn't know yet what the next chapter was going to cost them all. The next 3 days settled into a rhythm that felt almost ordinary, which was itself extraordinary, given everything that had come before. Nora woke before the sun each morning dressed in the dark, and was downstairs before Caleb had finished his first cup of coffee. She didn't ask what needed doing. She watched, and then she did it. She gathered eggs from the henhouse without being shown twice. She learned the temperament of the milk cow, a stubborn red and white creature named Biscuit, who'd kick if you moved too fast, but would stand patient as stone if you talked to her steady and quiet. She pumped water and carried it, and swept floors and beat dust from rugs, and did it all without being asked because being useful was the only currency she had. Caleb watched her without comment for 2 days. On the third morning, he set his coffee cup down and said, "You don't have to prove yourself, Nora." "I know that," she said without stopping what she was doing. "I don't think you do." He pulled out a chair and sat. "You've been working like someone who's afraid of being sent away." She turned from the stove then. Met his eyes directly the way she'd learned was the fastest route to understanding a person's intentions. "Aren't I?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "No. You say that now. I'll say it again in a month. Same answer." He picked up his cup. "Now sit down and eat your breakfast before it gets cold. You're no good to anybody if you work yourself into the ground." She sat. It was harder than it should have been sitting still when there were things to do. But she was learning that Caleb Rourke meant what he said, and said what he meant, and that was a rarer quality in people than it ought to have been. Rosie came downstairs midway through breakfast, her hair catastrophically tangled and her rag doll tucked under her arm, and stopped dead in the kitchen doorway when she saw Caleb at the table. "Good morning," Caleb said. Rosie looked at him the way small children look at things they're trying to decide about with her whole face. Then she looked at Nora. "He's still here," she said. "It's his house, Rosie May." "Oh." Rosie considered this. "Are we still here too?" "Yes," Caleb said before Nora could answer. Rosie considered him a moment longer. Then she climbed into the chair beside Nora and reached for the bread. "Do you have any jam?" Something shifted in Caleb's expression. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was in the neighborhood of one. He got up without a word, went to the shelf and came back with a small jar of blackberry preserves that he set in front of Rosie without ceremony. Rosie looked at the jar, looked up at him. "Thank you," she said very seriously. "You're welcome," he said equally serious. That was the morning things began to shift between them, not dramatically, not with any announcement, just the small daily accumulation of shared meals and shared work, and the particular intimacy that comes from two people learning each other's silences. On the fourth day, Caleb said he needed to go into town for supplies. He said it to Nora over breakfast, watching her face when he said it. "I think you and Rosie should come," he added. "Better for people to see you out in the open than to have them wondering what I'm hiding out here." Nora's stomach tightened. "Will there be trouble?" "There might be talk. There's always talk in a town this size, but talk's easier to manage head-on than from behind a locked door." He looked at her steadily. "You've faced worse than gossip." He wasn't wrong. Rosie was thrilled by the prospect of town. She asked 17 questions during the wagon ride, most of them about whether there would be candy and whether the horses in town were bigger or smaller than Caleb's horses, and whether she could name the one that pulled the wagon. Caleb answered every question with the same patient brevity he applied to everything, and Nora sat between them and watched him from the corner of her eye, still taking his measure, still trying to understand what kind of man he actually was, underneath the hard-set face and the few words. The town of Millhaven was bigger than she'd expected, a main street lined with false-fronted buildings, and enough traffic to suggest it took itself seriously. She saw a church, a hotel, a bank, a saloon, a livery stable, and a general store with a hand-painted sign that read, "Whitfield's Goods and Sundries." Caleb guided the wagon to the front of it and set the brake. "Stay close," he said, "and let me do the talking at first." The store was cool and dim inside, smelling of coffee and sawdust, and the particular dry sweetness of bulk goods stored in barrels. A woman looked up from behind the counter as the bell over the door announced them. She was perhaps 40, with dark hair threaded through with early silver, pulled back from a face that was handsome rather than pretty and sharp in the way that came from having learned to rely entirely on herself. She wore a gray cotton dress and a white apron, and her eyes were the kind of steady brown that assessed everything they landed on. "Caleb Rourke," she said. "You're in early this week." "Needed supplies." He gestured behind him. "Agnes, these are the Calloway girls, Nora and Rosie. They're staying with me for the time being." Agnes Whitfield came around the counter slowly. She looked at them the way Clara, the store owner Nora had imagined in her better moments might have looked. Thorough, careful, without the performative pity that some adults deployed like a weapon. "Staying with you." She repeated, her voice giving nothing away. "Their mother passed 4 days ago. They had nowhere else to go." Caleb's voice was steady. "I'm providing shelter until something more permanent can be arranged." Agnes looked at Nora for a long moment. Nora looked back. She was tired of being looked at like a problem to be solved, and she suspected Agnes could tell. "What can you do?" Agnes asked her directly. Nora blinked. "Ma'am, what can you do?" "Cook, sew, figure numbers." "What?" "I can cook decent and sew well. I know remedies, herb medicine. My mother kept a journal." Nora paused. "I'm a fast learner." Agnes held her gaze another moment. Then she glanced at Rosie, who had found a bolt of red calico and was examining it with the reverence usually reserved for sacred objects. "That one's got taste," Agnes said dryly. "That's the most expensive fabric in the store." "Rosie!" Nora's voice carried the exact tone that made her sister look up and take 2 steps back from the calico. Something like approval passed briefly across Agnes Whitfield's expression. She turned back to Caleb. "Come on and give me your list. I'll fill your order." Over her shoulder, she said, "Nora, there's herbs drying in the back room if you want to look. Doors open." It wasn't an invitation exactly. It was more like a test. Nora went. The back room was small and south-facing, with bundles of dried herbs hanging from the ceiling rafters and jars of tinctures arranged on shelves with meticulous precision. Nora stood in the doorway and breathed it in, the smell of chamomile and yarrow and something sharper she couldn't immediately name, and felt the first genuine stir of something other than grief in days. She moved carefully through the space, reading labels, recognizing plants her mother had written about in the journal, finding 3 she'd never encountered. "Valerian," Agnes said from behind her. Nora hadn't heard her come in. "The one you're staring at. Good for sleep. Strong taste. You have to use it carefully or it'll make people feel worse before they feel better." "My mother wrote about it," Nora said. "She never had any, though. It didn't grow near us." "Where'd your mother learn her remedies?" "Her own mother, and a midwife who lived near them when she was young." Nora turned to face her. She was good at it. People came to her when they were sick, even after she got too sick herself to help them much. Agnes was quiet for a moment. "I could use someone with steady hands and a good memory," she said at last. "I've got arthritis coming on in my right hand. The detailed work, the measuring, the fine grinding, it's getting harder." She crossed her arms. "I can't pay much, but I can pay something, and I can teach." Nora stared at her. "You're offering me work." "I'm offering you the chance to make yourself useful in a way that serves both of us. If you're as capable as you seem, we'll get along fine. If you're not, we'll know quick enough and no harm done." Agnes tilted her head. "Saturday mornings to start. You'd bring your sister." "She wouldn't be any trouble." "No, I don't expect she would be." Agnes glanced back toward the front of the store, where Rosie could be heard asking Caleb whether the candy jar was real crystal. "Saturday, then. 8 o'clock. Nora nodded. "Yes, ma'am. Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. I'm a demanding teacher." They were loading the wagon when a man approached on foot, moving with the deliberate purpose of someone carrying official weight. He was older, silver-haired, with a badge on his vest that caught the afternoon sun. "Caleb." His voice was cordial but watchful. "Sheriff Braddock." Caleb kept loading the crate. "Word travels fast," Braddock said. He looked at Nora and Rosie without pretending he wasn't looking. "These the Calloway girls?" "They are." Their mother passed. Not a question. 4 days ago, consumption. Caleb straightened and turned. They came to my ranch seeking help. I provided it. Braddock nodded slowly. His eyes were not unkind, but they were assessing. People are going to talk, Caleb. Man alone with 2 young girls. Let them. That's easy to say. It's also the truth. Caleb's voice dropped a register. I've done nothing wrong. Those girls needed help, and I gave it. If there's something dishonorable in that by this town's reckoning, then this town's reckoning is broken. Braddock was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at Nora directly. How are you being treated, Miss? Nora met his eyes. Well, sir, Mr. Rourke has given us food and shelter and treated us with respect. And your sister? She's well. Nora paused deliberately. She had blackberry jam on her bread this morning. First time she's smiled properly since Mama passed. Braddock looked at her for another moment. Something in his expression softened. He turned back to Caleb. Just be careful, he said. Not for my sake, for theirs. That's exactly what I'm being, Caleb said. On the ride home, Rosie fell asleep against Nora's shoulder. Her small hands curled in her lap, her breathing the deep, even rhythm of genuine peace. Caleb drove and said nothing for a while. The sage hills rolled past in long, slow waves on either side of the road, and the sun was beginning its afternoon decline. She offered me work, Nora said eventually. Mrs. Whitfield. I know, I heard. He kept his eyes on the road. Are you going to take it? Yes. No hesitation. She can teach me things Mama's journal can't, and we'll need money eventually. I'm not going to be kept on charity if I can help it. It's not charity. It feels like it. Caleb was quiet for a moment. What does it feel like when you work a fair day and get a fair day's pay? Honest, she said. Then work toward honest. Charity's just a bridge. Ain't nothing wrong with crossing a bridge when you need one long as you don't plan to live on it. He glanced at her sidelong. You planning to live on it? No, sir. Then we're fine. Nora looked out at the hills going past. She thought about her mother's journal on the shelf in the yellow room upstairs, all those careful pages of knowledge meant to be passed forward. She thought about Agnes Whitfield's steady hands, and the sharp smell of valerian root, and the rows of jars precisely labeled. She thought about what it might mean to be 10 years old and already have a direction, something to grow toward. Mr. Rourke, she said. Caleb. She glanced at him. Caleb. It felt strange in her mouth, too familiar, but he'd said it, so she used it. Did your daughter, Clara Jane, did she know what she wanted to be when she grew up? The silence that followed was long enough that she thought she'd gone too far again. But then he said she wanted to be a horse doctor, told me when she was 3 years old, wouldn't hear otherwise. That's a good thing to want. She was a determined little soul. His voice had gone rough at the edges. Stubborn as the day is long. Got it from her mother. Rosie's like that, Nora said. She decided this morning she's going to name every animal on your ranch, whether you agree or not. Caleb made a sound. It took Nora a moment to realize it was a laugh short and rusty from disuse, but real. That's so, he said. She's already named the milk cow Peaches. I told her it was already named Biscuit, and she said Biscuit was a silly name for a cow. She's not wrong, Caleb said. Rosie slept the whole way home, and Nora sat beside her in the warm afternoon light, one hand resting on her sister's knee, and let herself feel something that wasn't grief for the first time in days. She didn't have a name for it yet. It was something quieter than hope, but pointed in the same direction. The trouble started 9 days later on a Tuesday morning when the sky was low and gray and the air smelled of coming rain. Nora was in the henhouse when she heard horses. Multiple sets of hooves moving with the measured pace of people who'd come with purpose rather than visiting. She set down her egg basket and moved to the henhouse door, looking out through the narrow gap. 3 riders. Caleb came out of the barn before they'd fully dismounted, his posture shifting into something careful and still. Caleb Rourke, said the man in the dark suit, the one who was clearly not from anywhere near here. He had the clipped voice and the pressed clothing of county administration. "I'm Mr. Fenwick from the County Welfare Office. This is Deputy Crane." He gestured to the younger, harder-faced man beside him. "I believe you know Sheriff Braddock." Braddock looked uncomfortable. He stayed slightly back from the other two. "Wasn't expecting company," Caleb said. His voice was even, but Nora could see from here that his hands had gone still at his sides, in the way they went still when he was controlling something. "We have some questions about your current living situation," Fenwick said. "Specifically regarding the 2 minor girls currently residing on your property." Nora's heart dropped through the floor of her chest. "They're being cared for," Caleb said. "That remains to be assessed." Fenwick pulled a leather notebook from his coat. "You are unmarried, Mr. Rourke, living alone. This is a single-man household with no female presence of appropriate supervision. I'm their appropriate supervision. The county does not see it that way." Fenwick's voice was not cruel, but it was final in the way of men who believed policy was the same as justice. "I'll need to speak with the girls separately." "No." The word came out of Caleb's mouth without pause or inflection, the same way he said everything. "You won't." "Mr. Rourke, you come onto my property to check on those children's welfare. You're welcome to look around. You're welcome to see that they're fed and clothed and safe, but you will not separate them from each other or from me to ask them questions designed to find fault where there isn't any." Fenwick's expression tightened. "I have the authority. Then use it lawfully," Caleb said, "and I'll respond to it lawfully. But I know the county welfare statutes, Mr. Fenwick, and nothing in them requires me to let you interrogate frightened children alone." Braddock stepped forward, then his voice low. "Caleb, don't make this harder than it needs to be. I'm not making it anything. I'm standing in front of my house talking to men who've decided a widower feeding 2 orphaned girls is a scandal worth investigating." Caleb's jaw was set hard now. "Tell me what you actually need, and I'll tell you whether I can give it to you." Fenwick's jaw worked. He looked at his notebook. "The county requires that children in informal care situations reside in a household with proper dual adult supervision. A married household or at minimum a licensed facility." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the cattle had gone quiet. Nora pressed closer to the henhouse door. She could feel her own heartbeat in her throat. "How long?" Caleb said carefully. "How long would the county give me to arrange that?" Fenwick blinked, apparently not having expected the question to go in this direction. "What exactly are you proposing?" "I'm proposing you give me 2 weeks, Caleb said. 2 weeks to make this situation acceptable by your standards." "And how would you accomplish that in 2 weeks?" Caleb was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was completely level. "By getting married," he said. Nora heard Rosie's voice from somewhere above her from the upstairs window where her sister had apparently been watching the whole thing. "Nora," Rosie called down loud and carrying with absolutely no sense of the gravity of the moment. "Did he just say he's going to get married?" Caleb looked up at the window. Then he looked at Fenwick. 2 weeks, he said again. Fenwick's mouth had gone thin. He looked at Braddock, who had the expression of a man watching something he couldn't stop. "This is irregular." 2 weeks, Mr. Fenwick. Or you can explain to a judge why a man's willingness to take responsibility for orphaned children constitutes a threat to those same children's welfare. Another silence. A long one. 2 weeks, Fenwick said at last. "I'll require written confirmation from the woman in question that she has agreed to this arrangement, and there will be a home visit immediately following." He snapped the notebook shut. "If I find anything unsatisfactory, Mr. Rourke, those girls go into county care. Do you understand me?" "Completely," Caleb said. The 3 men mounted and rode back down the road. Caleb stood in the yard and watched them go. He stood there long enough that Nora slipped out of the henhouse and crossed the yard to stand beside him. He didn't look down at her. "You heard all that," he said. "Yes." "You have something to say about it?" "Yes." She kept her voice steady. "Who are you going to ask?" Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Agnes Whitfield." Nora thought about Agnes behind her store counter with her steady eyes and her arthritic right hand and her offer of honest work and fair teaching. She thought about the way Agnes had looked at Rosie with the calico bolt and said that one's got taste. She thought about the precision of those labeled jars. She might say no, Nora said. She might. Caleb agreed. What happens to us if she does? He finally looked down at her. His gray-green eyes were very direct. Then I find another way, he said. But I don't think she'll say no. He went to saddle his horse. Nora stood in the yard and watched him ride toward town and understood with a clarity that felt almost like pain that the lives of two sisters from the Copper Creek mining camp had just become something Caleb Rourke was willing to rearrange his entire world for. She went inside. She put a pot of water on the stove. She sat down at the kitchen table with her mother's journal and opened it to a page about chamomile, and she read the same sentence 6 times without seeing a single word. Caleb came back from town 2 hours later. Nora heard the horse before she saw him, and she was at the window when he rode in, dismounted, and led the animal to the barn with the unhurried movements of a man who'd made peace with whatever had just happened. She couldn't read anything from his posture. She'd been trying to learn how to read him for nearly 2 weeks and was still mostly guessing. She had supper on when he came inside. He hung his hat, washed his hands at the pump, and sat down at the table. She set a bowl in front of him and sat across from him and waited. She said yes, he said. Nora let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding for 2 hours. Just like that, she asked. Just like that. He picked up his spoon. She asked one question first. Asked what would happen to you girls if she said no. I told her the truth. She thought about it for about 30 seconds, and then she said yes. He paused. She also said 2 weeks was an absurd amount of time to plan a wedding, and that the county ought to be ashamed of itself. She's not wrong about that either, Nora said. From upstairs came the sound of Rosie's feet hitting the floor, and then the particular thunder of a 6-year-old who has been listening through the floorboards and can no longer contain herself. She appeared in the kitchen doorway with her hair wild and her rag doll upside down under her arm. Is Miss Agnes going to be our new mama? She demanded. She's going to be Mrs. Rourke, Nora said carefully. That's different. Is it? Nora looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at his soup. It's a start, he said. Agnes Whitfield arrived at the ranch the following Saturday with a trunk, a set of opinions about kitchen organization, and the calm efficiency of a woman who had long ago stopped waiting for the world to arrange itself to her liking and had simply begun arranging it herself. She and Caleb conducted their courtship, such as it was, in the practical language of 2 adults who understood what they were building, and why, which was not romance, but was not nothing either. Nora watched them carefully, the way she watched everything. Agnes did not pretend to feelings she didn't have. She did not perform warmth for the sake of appearances. But she was honest, and she was steady, and she had a way of seeing what a situation required and providing it without being asked, which Nora had come to understand was a form of love in itself, even if it didn't look like the kind in stories. One morning, Nora came downstairs to find Agnes at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and her mother's journal open in front of her. Nora stopped in the doorway. Agnes looked up. I found it on the shelf. I should have asked before I opened it. I'm sorry. What page are you on? Nora asked, instead of saying it was fine when she wasn't sure yet if it was. The willow bark entry. Your mother's notes in the margins are exceptional. She understood the why behind the what, which most people never bother to learn. Agnes closed the journal with care and slid it across the table. She was a real healer, Nora, not just a woman with recipes. Nora sat down and pulled the journal toward her. She said healing was a responsibility, that you had to earn the right to it by learning it properly. She was right. Agnes wrapped her hands around her cup. I'd like your permission to read it. Not to take anything from it, just to know it. She met Nora's eyes. It's yours, every word of it. But it's also knowledge, and knowledge kept locked away doesn't help anybody. Nora thought about it for a long moment. Her mother's handwriting on every page. Her mother's voice in every sentence. Yes, she said finally. "You can read it, but you have to tell me when you find something you recognize and when you find something you don't, so we can figure it out together." Agnes nodded. That's exactly how it should work. They were married on a Friday morning in the Millhaven church, 9 days after Caleb had ridden into town and asked a question that most men would not have had the nerve to ask. The guest list was small by necessity and choice. Sheriff Braddock and his wife, the preacher, Nora and Rosie. Agnes had one friend in town, a woman named Dorothy, who ran the boarding house, and Dorothy came and cried through the whole ceremony, as though personally invested in the outcome. Agnes wore a dress she'd had in her trunk for 5 years, the color of storm clouds, simple and well-made. She carried a handful of wild yellow flowers that Rosie had gathered that morning at first light, presenting them with great ceremony and a gap-toothed smile. Caleb wore his Sunday coat. His hands were steady when he put the ring on Agnes's finger, steadier than Nora's own hands, which she kept clasped in her lap so nobody would see them shaking. When the preacher said the words that made it legal and real, Rosie grabbed Nora's arm with both hands and whispered, "Now we're a family," with such conviction that Dorothy cried harder. Nora didn't correct her. She wasn't sure it needed correcting. The reception, such as it was, took place at Agnes's store, where Dorothy had set out a cake, and Rosie ate 2 slices and fell asleep in a chair before noon. Agnes and Caleb stood side by side talking to the few people who'd come and bore the occasion with the same competent reserve they brought to everything, and Nora sat with her sleeping sister and watched them and tried to understand what she was feeling. It wasn't what she'd expected to feel. There was relief in it, that solid ground, where there had been nothing but air. But there was something more complicated too, something that had to do with watching 2 people choose each other for reasons that had started with her and Rosie, and had already, she could tell, grown into something that had its own reasons now. She was glad. That was the simplest word for it. She was glad for all of them. Fenwick came for his inspection 6 days after the wedding, arriving unannounced on a Wednesday afternoon with Deputy Crane and a list of things he intended to verify. Agnes answered the door. Nora, who had been in the kitchen preparing a tincture, heard the exchange from the hallway. "Mr. Fenwick," Agnes said, in the voice she used with difficult customers. Cordial, impenetrable. What a surprise! "Mrs. Rourke." Fenwick sounded slightly thrown by that, as though the reality of the marriage was still catching up with him. "I'm here to conduct the follow-up assessment." "Of course you are. Come in." Nora pressed herself back against the kitchen wall as Fenwick and Crane moved through the house. She heard their footsteps on the stairs. Heard Fenwick's voice asking questions in the clipped tone of a man filling out a form in his head. Heard Agnes answering each one with the same calm precision she brought to everything. When they came back downstairs and into the kitchen, Nora was standing at the work table with her hands quiet and her chin up because she had learned from watching Agnes that stillness was its own kind of answer. Fenwick looked at the jars she was working with, at the neat labels, at the journal open beside her. "What are you making?" he asked. "Elderberry tincture," Nora said. "For the Mason's youngest. She's had a chest cough for 2 weeks." Fenwick looked at Crane. Crane looked at the tincture. "The children sleep where?" Fenwick asked, turning to Agnes. "Upstairs, 2nd bedroom." Agnes's voice was even. "Would you like to see it?" He would. He did. Nora heard them above her, heard the floorboards creak as he walked the room. She and Rosie shared the yellow room that had been Clara Jane's, that still held the porcelain doll on the dresser and the star quilt on the bed. She heard Rosie's voice, bright and unintimidated, telling Fenwick about the kitten she'd adopted from the barn and its many exceptional qualities. When they came back down, Fenwick's notebook was in his hands, but he wasn't writing in it. "The arrangement appears satisfactory," he said, and something in his tone suggested he'd arrived, hoping to find otherwise, and found himself without ammunition. "The county will continue to monitor." "Mr. Fenwick." Agnes stepped forward, and Nora had a clear view of her face, which was the face of a woman who had run a business alone for 5 years and had dealt with more difficult men than this one. Those girls have lost their mother and their father and their home. They have found here what every child deserves, people who want them. Stability, safety, Purpose. If the county's continued monitoring is meant to serve their welfare, we welcome it. If it's meant to serve something else, I'd ask you to be honest about that. Fenwick's jaw tightened. It is meant to serve their welfare. Then we'll have no trouble, Agnes said. Good day. He left. Agnes closed the door, leaned against it for exactly 3 seconds, and then straightened and walked back to the kitchen. Nora, she said. Yes, ma'am. How's that tincture coming along? Nearly done. Good. The Masons will be waiting. That was the last they heard from Fenwick for 3 weeks. 3 weeks during which the ranch settled into its new configuration. 4 people learning each other's rhythms, the way people do when they're genuinely trying with patience and backsliding, and the occasional flare of friction that is itself a sign that something real is being built. Caleb and Agnes were not in love. Nora knew this the way she knew most true things, by watching rather than asking. But they respected each other. They talked to each other honestly, which Nora had come to understand was rarer and more durable than romance. And sometimes in the evenings when the work was done, and Rosie was already asleep, and Nora was supposed to be, she could hear them at the kitchen table talking in the low voices of people who are learning that they like each other, which is its own kind of beginning. The stranger arrived on a Thursday, 3 weeks and 2 days after the wedding. Nora heard the hoofbeats from the garden where she was weeding Agnes's herb bed. She heard the knock on the front door. She heard Agnes's voice, and then a man's voice, unfamiliar, and carrying the particular smoothness of someone who had practiced sounding trustworthy. She stood up slowly. Something in her chest pulled tight. She didn't know why yet. She only knew that her body had gotten good at recognizing danger before her mind caught up to it. She went around to the back door and into the kitchen, and stood just inside the hallway, where she could hear without being seen. I'm looking for 2 girls, the man was saying. Nora and Rosie Calloway. I have reason to believe they're residing here. And you are. Agnes's voice gave nothing. Warren Calloway, their uncle. I've come to take my nieces home. The floor felt uncertain under Nora's feet. She had not heard that name in 4 years. Her father had stopped speaking it. Her mother had written it in the journal only twice in entries that Nora had read 3 times each, pressing her finger against the words, as though she could feel her mother's intent through the paper. Warren Calloway, Thomas's brother. The one her father had cut ties with before Nora was old enough to understand why the one her mother had written about with a wariness that reading it now felt like prophecy. Their uncle, Agnes repeated. That's curious. Those girls have been here nearly 2 months, and this is the first we're hearing of any uncle. I've been out of state, working a claim in Colorado. Only just got word about my sister-in-law's passing. Warren's voice shifted into something that sounded like grief and was just slightly too smooth. It's been a hard thing finding out that way. My brother's girls left alone. Agnes said nothing else. I'd like to see them. My nieces. You'll want to speak with my husband about that, Agnes said. He's the one who took the girls in, Caleb. Her voice lifted slightly. We have a visitor. Nora heard Caleb's boots on the porch steps and then through the front door, and she pressed closer to the hallway wall and breathed deliberately, the way Agnes had taught her to breathe when she was working with something that required precision. Mr. Rourke. Warren's voice shifted again, recalibrating for a man rather than a woman. Warren Calloway, I believe you have my nieces here. I've come to bring them home with me. Is that right? Caleb said. It was not a question. They're my brother's children, last living family they've got. Surely you understand a man's responsibility to his blood. What I understand, Caleb said, is that those girls walked 3 miles through Wyoming summer heat to my door because they had no food, no shelter, and nowhere else to go. Where were you then? Warren's pause was just slightly too long. I didn't know the situation. If I had, you didn't write? You didn't send money? You didn't check on your brother's widow or his children in the 14 months between his death and hers? Caleb's voice was flat as a board. Now she's been in the ground 3 weeks and here you are. I've explained that. I was in Colorado. What claim? Agnes said. Warren stopped. You said you were working a claim in Colorado, Agnes said, and her voice had gone to the same temperature it used when she was calculating whether a supplier was trying to cheat her on weight. What kind of claim? Mining, silver mostly. Your own or a company operation? My own. A pause. What does that have to do with anything? Nothing at all, perhaps, Agnes said pleasantly. I'm just curious about a man who's been working his own silver claim in Colorado and somehow couldn't spare the postage for a letter to his brother's widow. Warren let that sit for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had a new quality, something underneath the smoothness that hadn't been visible before. Mr. Rourke, I understand you've gone to considerable trouble for these girls. I appreciate that, truly. But they're Calloway's, and they belong with their own. That's not something I'm willing to negotiate. Good, Caleb said. Neither am I. Another silence. I have papers, Warren said. Birth records. Legal documentation establishing my relationship to those children. By blood right. Blood right doesn't feed a child, Caleb said. Blood right doesn't bury their mother or ride 3 miles in July heat to make sure they're not dying of thirst on a dirt road. Whatever the law says about blood right, I'd be interested to know what a judge says about a man who appeared 2 months late claiming it. A judge will say what the law says, Warren said, and the smoothness had dropped away entirely now. What was underneath it was harder and colder. Those girls are minors. They have a living male relative. Courts favor blood. He paused. I'm trying to do this the easy way, Mr. Rourke, for everyone's sake, including those children's. But if you want to make it difficult, I'm prepared for that conversation too. So am I, Caleb said. Nora heard the front door open, heard Warren's boots on the porch, heard the sound of a horse being mounted, and then the hoofbeats moving away down the road, unhurried and deliberate, the pace of a man who believed he had time on his side. Then silence. Then Caleb's voice quiet. She heard all of it, Agnes. I know, Agnes said. Nora, come on out. Nora came out of the hallway. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the two of them. Caleb with his jaw set and his hands still. Agnes with her arms folded and her eyes sharp. He's after the claim, Nora said. They both looked at her. Papa filed a mining claim before he died. She heard her own voice steady and far away like someone else talking. I was little, maybe 6 or 7. I heard him talking to another miner about a vein he'd found, about keeping it quiet until he was sure. He never talked about it again, and then he died, and we never had any money, so I thought maybe it had come to nothing. She swallowed. But maybe it didn't. Maybe Warren knows something we don't. Caleb and Agnes exchanged a look over her head. Agnes, Caleb said. I heard her. Agnes uncrossed her arms. If there's a registered claim in Thomas Calloway's name, his daughters inherit it. And a guardian? She stopped. A guardian controls it until they come of age, Caleb finished. Nora looked at him, at the truth settling across his face, confirming what she'd already understood. He doesn't want us, she said. He wants what Papa left us. And we didn't even know Papa left us anything. Caleb crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and crouched down in front of her the way he'd done that first terrible afternoon in the yard, so they were eye to eye. His face was very serious. Listen to me, he said. Whatever that claim is worth, whatever he thinks he's going to do with it, he is not taking you or your sister. Do you understand me? The law might say he can. Then we'll fight the law. His voice didn't waver. That's what lawyers are for. That's what judges are for. You stood up in front of that county man without flinching. Can you stand up in front of a judge? Nora thought about her mother's journal, about the entries with Warren's name in them, spare and careful and frightened in a way her mother had rarely allowed herself to be frightened. She thought about a woman dying alone in a one-room cabin writing warnings she hoped her daughter would never need to use. She thought about Rosie upstairs, who did not yet know that a man with her father's name had come to take her away from the first safe place she'd been in over a year. Yes, Nora said. I can stand up in front of a judge. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Something passed through his gray-green eyes that she recognized now had seen before, the thing that was grief and determination and fiercely protective love, all braided together into something that didn't have a name but was stronger than any of them separately. "Good," he said. He stood. "Then here's what we're going to do." He turned to Agnes and they began to talk quickly and quietly about lawyers and county records and land offices and the specific language of inheritance law, and Nora stood between them and listened and committed every word to the same part of her memory, where she kept her mother's remedies precise and retrievable and ready to be used when needed. Upstairs, she heard Rosie singing to her kitten, something tuneless and cheerful, completely unaware that the world had just tilted under them again. Nora held very still and let the two adults around her be adults for a moment. She allowed herself exactly that much. Then she straightened her spine and started thinking about what she remembered from her mother's journal about Warren Calloway, and how much of it a judge might be willing to hear. Caleb rode into town the next morning before sunrise and came back with two things: a confirmed appointment with the county land office and the name of a lawyer named Martha Hale, who ran her practice out of a single room above the hardware store, and had a reputation, according to Agnes, for being the kind of woman who won cases that men assumed she'd lose. Martha Hale came to the ranch that same afternoon. She was somewhere between 40 and 50, lean and precise, with wire-rimmed spectacles, and the unhurried manner of someone who had learned that urgency and panic were not the same thing, and had no patience for confusing the two. She sat at the kitchen table, laid out a clean sheet of paper, and looked at Nora. "Tell me everything," she said. "Don't decide what's important. Let me do that." So Nora told her. All of it. The mining camp and her father's death and her mother's slow dying and the walk across the Wyoming flats with Rosie's hand in hers. Warren Calloway's visit. The smoothness in his voice that wasn't quite right. And finally, the memory she'd been turning over since the day before, half heard through a cabin wall when she was 6 years old. Her father's voice, low and careful, talking about a vein he'd found and the claim he intended to file. Martha wrote steadily through all of it. "The journal," she said when Nora finished. "Your mother's journal. You said she wrote about Warren Calloway. 3 times. The entries are short, but they're clear. She was afraid of him. She didn't use that word, but you can feel it." "May I see it?" Nora went upstairs and came back with the journal and set it on the table. Martha read each relevant entry twice, her expression unchanged, and then sat back. "This is useful," she said. "Not conclusive on its own, but useful. A dying woman's written account of her fears about a specific individual constitutes a form of testimony." She looked at Caleb. "I need to go to the county land office before Warren does, if he hasn't already. If Thomas Calloway filed a claim, I need to see it and know its status before we walk into any courtroom." "I'll ride with you tomorrow," Caleb said. "No, you'll stay here with the girls." She closed her notebook. "Send Agnes." A woman asking questions at a land office draws less attention than a man with a visible stake in the outcome. Agnes, who had been listening from the doorway, said, "I'll be ready at first light." Martha looked at Nora one more time before she left. "I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly, not the way you think I want to hear it. Honestly." "All right," Nora said. "If this goes before a judge, and the judge asks you directly whether you want to go with your uncle, what will you say?" Nora didn't hesitate. "I'll say no, and I'll say why. Even if the judge pushes back. Even if Warren's lawyer tries to make it sound like you've been coached or frightened into saying it. I'll say it anyway." Nora held Martha's gaze. "I've been saying true things to adults who didn't want to hear them my whole life. I know how to do that." Martha looked at her for a long moment with the expression of someone recalculating something. "Good," she said. "That's what I needed to know." Agnes came back from the land office the following afternoon with a face that was carefully neutral and a piece of paper that was not. She spread it on the kitchen table, and Caleb and Martha, who had returned, leaned over it together. Thomas Calloway had filed the claim 4 months before the shaft collapse. A section of land adjacent to the Copper Creek main operation filed in his name alone, never transferred, never sold, never developed. The county surveyor who had looked at it 6 weeks ago, brought in by a party whose name was listed in the inquiry log, had estimated the site's potential value in language that even Nora reading over their shoulders could understand. Considerable. That was the surveyor's word. The name in the inquiry log was Warren Calloway. He knew before he came here, Agnes said quietly. He'd already had it surveyed. Which means he came here with a plan, Martha said. She straightened up. He wasn't surprised by the claim. He was surprised the girls were in a stable home with legal guardians. That's what he hadn't counted on. Can we use this? Caleb asked. We can use it to establish motive, to show the court that his interest in those children is financial rather than familial. Martha folded the paper and put it in her case. The hearing's set for Monday. Warren's lawyer filed for expedited review on the grounds that the girls are living with non-relatives. Judge Carver granted it. She looked around the table. That gives us 4 days. 4 days passed. The way difficult things always passed for Nora, simultaneously too fast and too slow. Each hour dragging, and the whole of it gone before she'd caught her breath. Martha came every afternoon and walked Nora through what the courtroom would look like, what kinds of questions would be asked, how to speak clearly without letting her voice shake. Your voice will want to shake, Martha said on the 3rd afternoon. That's all right. Let it shake and keep talking anyway. A frightened child telling the truth is more convincing than a composed one who sounds rehearsed. What if I cry? Then you cry, but don't let it stop you. Martha looked at her over her spectacles. You've already done the hard thing, Nora. You kept your sister alive and walked toward help when most children would have sat down in the road and given up. Telling the truth in a courtroom is nothing compared to that. Rosie knew something was wrong. She'd known since Warren's visit, in the way small children know things not through information, but through the quality of the air around the adults they depended on. She stopped asking questions, which was more alarming than her usual torrent of them. She stayed close to Nora in the evenings, pressed against her side on the settle, her ragdoll held tight. On Sunday night, the eve of the hearing, she climbed into Nora's bed instead of her own, and lay quietly in the dark for a long time before she spoke. Is that man going to make us leave? She asked. Nora kept her voice steady. We're going to court tomorrow. A judge is going to decide. What if the judge says we have to go? Then we'll figure out what comes next. Rosie was quiet. That's what you said before, when we were walking to Mr. Rourke's. You said if the people there weren't nice, we'd figure out the next thing after that. I remember. And the people there were nice. Rosie turned her head toward her sister in the dark. So maybe the judge will be nice too. Nora pressed her lips together hard for a moment. Maybe so Rosie may. I don't want to go with that man. Rosie's voice was very small now. He smiles wrong. Nora put her arm around her sister and pulled her close. I know he does. Promise me we won't have to. Nora held her sister and looked at the dark ceiling and thought about her mother writing warnings in a journal she knew she'd never be alive to enforce. Thought about Caleb riding to a mining camp in summer heat to bury a woman he'd never met. Thought about Agnes saying those girls have lost everything, and I won't be the reason they lose each other too. I promise I'll fight with everything I have, she said. That's the most honest promise I can make you. Rosie considered this with the seriousness she brought to important things. Okay, she said. That's a good promise. The Millhaven courthouse was a square brick building that smelled of old wood and official paper, and the particular tension of matters that would be decided here and lived with everywhere else. Nora walked in beside Agnes, with Rosie's hand in hers, and Caleb just behind them, and she made herself look at everything directly, rather than letting her eyes slide away the way they wanted to. Warren was already there with his lawyer, a thick-necked man named Graves, who looked like he'd won arguments by sitting on them. Warren wore a dark suit and had arranged his face into an expression of concerned paternal interest that made Nora's stomach turn over. He looked at her when she came in and smiled with his mouth only the same wrong smile Rosie had identified in approximately 30 seconds. Judge Carver was older, white-haired, with the expression of a man who had heard most things people were capable of saying and had arrived at a measured view of all of them. He called the court to order, and the proceedings began. Graves spoke first, and he was good at it in the way that blunt instruments were good at what they did. Blood rights, family duty, the importance of children knowing their own kin, the unsuitability of placing orphaned girls in a household of strangers when living relatives existed. He used the word strangers 4 times, leaning on it like a post. Martha let him finish. Then she stood and she spoke about facts. About a man who had not written, not visited, not sent a single dollar to his brother's widow across 14 months of her dying. About a mining claim surveyed at Warren Calloway's specific request 6 weeks before he appeared at the ranch door. About a mother's written words preserved in her own hand expressing fear of this man with a clarity that grief and illness had not diminished. She entered the journal into evidence. She read the 3 entries aloud. The courtroom was very quiet while she did it. Warren's expression didn't change, but his hands on the table in front of him pressed flat in a way that told Nora he was working to keep them still. Then Graves called Warren to the stand, and Warren testified with the practiced ease of a man who was comfortable constructing versions of reality that served his purposes. He spoke about family, about duty, about how he'd heard the news of his sister-in-law's death and come immediately, how he'd been grieved to find his nieces in a stranger's home, how it was simply right that children belonged with blood, and the mining claim registered in Thomas Calloway's name, Martha said when she stood to question him. Were you aware of it before you came to Millhaven? I may have heard something. You commissioned a survey of it 6 weeks before your arrival. The survey is dated September 4th. You arrived here October 16th. She held up the land office document. Were you aware of the claim before you came to Millhaven, Mr. Calloway? A pause. I knew Thomas had filed something. I wasn't certain it amounted to anything. But you had it surveyed to find out. A man has a right to understand what his family's assets are. His family's assets, Martha repeated. Those assets belong to Nora and Rosie Calloway. They inherited them upon their mother's death. A guardian, of course, would control those assets until the girls came of age. She looked at him over her spectacles. Would control them and the income from them entirely. Graves objected. Judge Carver overruled him. Warren's jaw moved. I'm here for those girls, not for any piece of ground. Then you won't object to the court appointing an independent trustee for the claim completely separate from any guardian's control. The silence that followed lasted long enough to answer the question without words. No further questions, Martha said. Nora was called next. She walked to the stand on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else, and sat down and looked at Judge Carver and waited. Nora, the judge said, and his voice was gruff but not unkind. I know this is a difficult situation for a young person. I'm going to ask you some questions, and I need you to answer them as honestly as you can. Can you do that? Yes, sir. How long have you been living with the Rourkes? Nearly 2 months, sir. And in that time, how have they treated you? Nora thought about chamomile tea left outside her door on a morning Agnes had heard her crying before dawn. About Caleb teaching her to read the land the way he read it, with respect for what it was, rather than just what it could give you. About Rosie naming every animal on the ranch and nobody telling her to stop. Like we matter, she said. Not like a problem they're waiting to solve. Like we actually matter to them. Carver made a note. And your uncle, do you know him? Not well. Papa kept distance between us. Mama wrote about why. She paused. I know enough. What do you know? I know he came here 2 months after Mama died. I know he had Papa's claim surveyed before he came. I know that when he talked to Mr. Rourke and Mrs. Rourke, he didn't ask how we were. He asked where we were. She held the judge's gaze. A man who's come for his nieces asks how they are. A man who's come for something else asks where they are. Carver looked at her for a long moment. If I were to rule in your uncle's favor today, he said carefully, what would you do? Nora didn't look at Caleb, didn't look at Agnes. She'd thought about this answer since Martha had asked her the same question, and she knew it the way she knew her mother's remedies completely, and without doubt. "I'd run," she said. "I'd take Rosie, and I'd run, and we'd keep running until we found somewhere he couldn't follow. And if he caught us, I'd run again." Her voice didn't shake. "I promised my mother I'd keep Rosie safe. I've never broken a promise to her, not while she was alive and not since she died." The courtroom was absolutely still. "I'm not asking you to break that promise," Carver said quietly. "Then please don't give me a reason to have to," Nora said. Rosie testified last in the small, clear voice of a child who had decided this was an important moment and was behaving accordingly. She told the judge she was happy at the ranch, that she had a kitten named Butterscotch and a mare named Clover, and that Mrs. Rourke was teaching her to make biscuits. That she didn't remember Uncle Warren. That she wanted to stay with Nora always wherever Nora was, and that Mr. Rourke and Mrs. Rourke were good, and she trusted them. "One more question," Carver said. "Your sister said she'd run if I ruled against you. Would you run with her?" Rosie looked at him with complete composure. "I always go where Nora goes," she said. "That's just how it is." Carver dismissed her and called for closing arguments, and then retired to consider his ruling, and the wait was the longest 40 minutes of Nora's life. She sat between Agnes and Caleb in the front row with her hands folded in her lap, and her eyes on the floor, turning her mother's words over in her mind, like stones worn smooth. Agnes put her hand over Nora's at some point, and Nora turned her hand over and held on without looking up. When Carver came back, he settled behind his bench and looked at his papers for a moment before he looked at the room. His expression gave nothing away until he began to speak. "This court has considered the evidence and testimony presented by both parties." His voice was measured and deliberate. "Mr. Warren Calloway has presented a blood claim that under ordinary circumstances carries legal weight. However, the circumstances before this court are not ordinary." He paused. "The evidence strongly suggests that Mr. Calloway's interest in his nieces is materially connected to the mining claim registered in their father's name, and that his appearance at this late date was timed to coincide with information he obtained through his own investigation of that claim's value." Warren's lawyer shifted in his seat. "Furthermore," Carver continued, "the testimony of Margaret Calloway, preserved in her own hand prior to her death, demonstrates a pattern of concern about this individual that this court cannot dismiss. A mother's dying words about the welfare of her children carry moral weight that the law is not obligated to ignore." He looked at Warren directly. "Mr. Calloway, your claim of familial concern is not supported by your actions across the past 14 months. This court finds it is not supported now." Warren's face had gone very still. "It is the ruling of this court that full legal guardianship of Nora Jean Calloway and Rosie Mae Calloway is hereby awarded to Caleb and Agnes Rourke." Carver's voice was firm and final. "The mining claim registered in Thomas Calloway's name will be held in independent trust for the girls until they reach majority. Mr. Warren Calloway's petition is denied. Furthermore, this court orders that Mr. Calloway have no contact with these children without their expressed consent once they are of age to give it. Any violation of this order will be met with the full weight of this court's authority." The gavel came down. Nora heard it as though from a distance, a clean, sharp sound that landed somewhere in the center of her chest and stayed there warm and definitive. Warren stood abruptly, his chair scraping loud across the floor. His lawyer put a hand on his arm, but Warren shook it off and looked directly at Nora across the courtroom, and his face had dropped every pretense. Now everything smooth and careful was gone, and what was underneath was cold and hard and genuinely angry. He looked at her like she had taken something from him. She looked back at him without looking away. Then Caleb was there, stepping between them with the same quiet finality he brought to everything that required it. And Warren's gaze met Caleb's, and something passed between them that required no words, and Warren turned and walked out of the courtroom without another sound. The door swung shut behind him. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Rosie, who had been sitting beside Dorothy on the second row and had apparently decided that the moment the door closed counted as official, launched herself off the bench and ran across the courtroom and grabbed Nora around the middle with both arms. "We won," she announced into Nora's ribs. "We won, we won, we won." Nora wrapped her arms around her sister and pressed her face into Rosie's wild curls, and breathed, just breathed, and felt the knot that had been living in the center of her chest since the morning she'd pulled a quilt over her mother's face begin very slowly to loosen. Caleb's hand landed on her shoulder and Agnes's hand on the other side, and they stood there in the middle of the Millhaven courthouse, the four of them not performing anything for anyone, just holding on to each other in the specific way of people who understand what they almost lost. Judge Carver watched them from behind his bench and said nothing, which was its own form of acknowledgement. Martha Hale packed her papers with the satisfied efficiency of a woman who had gone into the room expecting to win and had done so. When she passed Nora, she paused and put one hand briefly on the girl's head, a gesture so quick and so genuine that Nora almost missed it. "Your mother would have liked this outcome," Martha said simply, and walked on. Outside, the afternoon was clear and cold. The mountains close in the way they got before snow, and Millhaven's Main Street carried on around them with its ordinary business, completely unaware that something permanent had just been decided inside that brick building. Dorothy was crying, which appeared to be Dorothy's primary way of responding to strong emotion. Agnes gave her a handkerchief. Rosie told her that crying was okay, because sometimes you just had to. Sheriff Braddock shook Caleb's hand and said he was glad it had gone the right way, and Caleb said he was too quietly meaning it. Nora stood on the courthouse steps and looked out at the town and the mountains behind it, and understood that the world was the same as it had been this morning. The same dirt, the same sky, the same November cold in the air, and everything was completely different. Not because anything had changed around her, but because something had been settled inside her that she had not known was still unsettled. Rosie appeared at her elbow and slipped her hand into Nora's, the way she'd been doing since she was 2 years old. "Can we go home now?" Rosie asked. Nora looked at her sister, thought about a yellow room with white curtains and a star quilt and a porcelain doll placed by someone who had loved a child with everything they had. Thought about a kitchen that smelled of herbs and coffee and honest work. Thought about two people who had rearranged their entire lives for two girls they hadn't known 2 months ago and had never once made them feel like a burden for it. "Yeah, Rosie May," she said. "Let's go home." The ride home from the courthouse was quiet, in the way that follows something enormous. Not the hollow quiet of loss, but the full quiet of relief that hasn't yet found its words. Rosie fell asleep against Agnes's shoulder before they'd cleared the edge of town, one hand still loosely holding the ribbon from her courthouse braids. Caleb drove. Agnes kept one arm around Rosie and looked out at the mountains going past. Nora sat on Caleb's other side and watched the road and let herself feel the weight of the day settling through her bones. After a while, Caleb said without preamble, "You did well in there." "Martha did well," Nora said. "Martha did her job. You did something harder." He kept his eyes on the road. "You told the truth in front of people who had reasons to not want to hear it. That takes a different kind of courage than most adults manage." Nora looked at her hands in her lap. "I kept thinking about what Mama would have said if she'd been there." What would she have said? She would have said, "Speak plainly, and don't embellish, and let the truth carry its own weight." Nora paused. She said that a lot, about remedies and about people both. That if something was real, you didn't need to dress it up. Caleb nodded slowly. "She sounds like she was a wise woman. She was the wisest person I ever knew." Nora's voice stayed steady. "I didn't understand that when she was alive. You don't. When someone's just your mother, you think they're just the person who makes the bread and mends the shirts. You don't see all of it until they're gone, and you're standing in the middle of a life they built you and realizing how much of it they made from nothing." The ranch appeared on the horizon as the last of the afternoon light went long and golden across the pasture, and Nora felt the same thing she'd been feeling each time she came back to it now, a settling in her chest, a recognition that had no adequate word in English, and maybe in any language. Home was not quite it, because home implied a permanence she was still learning to trust, but it was the closest word she had. The days that followed were ordinary in all the best ways. Nora went to the store on Saturday mornings, and worked with Agnes in the back room, grinding and measuring and learning the logic of remedies that went deeper than recipes into actual understanding. Agnes was a demanding teacher who did not praise carelessly, which meant that when she said Nora had good instincts, it landed with the full weight of truth. Nora wrote everything down in the blank pages at the back of her mother's journal, adding her own entries below her mother's, in handwriting that was already beginning to look similar. The same small, even letters. The same habit of noting not just what, but why. Rosie went to the Millhaven schoolhouse 3 days a week and came home full of facts and opinions about her classmates, and questions that ranged from the genuinely curious to the philosophically bewildering. She had named, by Nora's count, 11 animals on the ranch. Caleb had stopped correcting her and had begun almost imperceptibly to use her names himself. One evening, Nora came downstairs late for a cup of water and found Caleb at the kitchen table with a block of wood and a set of carving tools, working by lamplight with the focused patience he brought to physical tasks. She stood in the doorway and watched him for a moment before he looked up. "Can't sleep?" he asked. "Just thirsty." She pumped herself a cup of water and sat down across from him. "What are you making?" He turned the block so she could see the rough shapes emerging. 4 figures, 2 tall and 2 small, standing close together. "Thought it was time we had something for the mantel," he said. "Something that showed who lives here." Nora looked at the 4 figures in the wood. Her throat went tight. "You can help if you want," he said. "Once I'm done carving, it needs sanding. Takes patience." "I have patience," she said. "I know you do." He turned the block back toward himself and picked up his tool. "That's one of the first things I noticed about you. Most children your age, they rush. You wait and watch and then you move." He worked a careful stroke along the grain. "Reminds me of how your mother must have been from what you've told me. That kind of patience with healing with people, it's not something you learn. It's something you're born with, and then someone shows you how to use it." Nora set her cup down. "Do you think she would have liked you?" "My mother?" Caleb was quiet for a moment, the lamplight catching the lines of his face. "I think she would have taken my measure pretty fast and made up her mind, and not wasted time pretending otherwise either way." "That's true," Nora said. "She was like that." She paused. "I think she would have liked you." He didn't respond to that directly, but something in his shoulders changed, a slight easing, and he kept carving, and they sat together in the quiet kitchen with the fire burning low, and the sound of Wyoming wind moving around the eaves, and it was enough. It was more than enough. 3 weeks after the hearing, Martha Hale came to the ranch with a document in a cream-colored envelope, and the expression of someone carrying good news. They're pleased to deliver. Agnes let her in and called for Caleb, and the 4 of them sat at the kitchen table while Nora read the document 3 times to make sure she understood it correctly. "The adoption was filed the week after the hearing," Martha said. "I pushed it through as quickly as I could. Judge Carver signed off yesterday." She folded her hands on the table. "You are now legally and permanently Nora Jean Rourke and Rosie Mae Rourke. Not wards, not charges. Daughters." Nora set the paper down very carefully. "We didn't want to say anything until it was final," Agnes said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were not. "We didn't want to promise something we couldn't guarantee." "You could have kept your birth name," Caleb said. "Carter. That was always your choice to make, not ours. The name means something. Your father's name, your mother's name. We understand that." Nora looked at the document. At the names typed there in official black ink. At the date and the judge's signature and the seal of the county that made it real in the eyes of every law there was. She thought about her father, Thomas Calloway, who had filed a mining claim in secret because he'd hoped it would secure his daughter's futures and had died before he could tell them. She thought about her mother, Margaret Calloway, who had washed other people's laundry with hands that should have been making medicines and had written warnings in a journal she knew she'd never be alive to enforce. She thought about the name Calloway, what it held, and what it had cost. Then she thought about a man who had ridden to a mining camp in summer heat to bury a woman he'd never met because her daughter had asked him to, and because it was the right thing to do. A woman who had said yes to an unusual question and meant it more with every passing week. A yellow room painted by someone who'd loved a child with everything they had opened again for two more children who needed it. "I want to be Nora Rourke," she said. "It doesn't mean I'm forgetting them, Mama and Papa. It doesn't mean the Calloway name didn't matter." She looked at Caleb, then at Agnes. "It means this is real, that you're real, that I'm not waiting for it to end anymore." Agnes made a sound that she turned into a cough and didn't fool anyone. Caleb reached across the table and covered Nora's hand with his for a moment, the same brief, certain gesture he'd used in the courtroom, and then he took his hand back and cleared his throat. "We're honored," he said, "more than you know." Rosie received the news that evening with characteristic directness. She sat on her bed with Butterscotch the kitten in her lap and listened to Nora explain it, and then she looked up and said, "So Caleb is our papa now, officially, if you want to call him that." Rosie considered it for approximately 4 seconds. "I already call him Papa Caleb in my head," she said. "I just wasn't sure if I was allowed." "You're allowed," Nora said. Rosie nodded, satisfied, and went back to the kitten. Then she looked up again. "Can I tell him tomorrow I want to tell him myself?" "Yes, Rosie May. You can tell him yourself." She did the next morning at breakfast, standing beside his chair with her chin up and her rag doll under her arm in the way she carried herself when she was being serious. She said, "Papa Caleb Nora says I can call you that out loud now and not just in my head, so I'm going to." Then she climbed into her chair and reached for the bread, and that was the entirety of it. Caleb looked at his coffee cup for a moment. His throat moved. Then he passed Rosie the butter and said, "That suits me fine, Rosie May," in the same voice he used for everything level and plain. And if it was rougher than usual at the edges, only Nora noticed. The carving was finished on a Friday evening in late November, the first real snow of the season coming down soft outside the windows. Nora had sanded it over the course of 2 weeks, working the grain smooth with patient strokes until the wood had the warmth of something alive under her hands. Caleb had carved words into the base in clean, careful letters, "The Rourke family." Agnes had rubbed it with oil until it glowed. They put it on the mantel together, all 4 of them, Rosie insisting on being lifted up to place it in the center herself, which she did with great ceremony, and stepped back to look at it with the satisfaction of someone who has put exactly the right thing in exactly the right place. 4 figures in Wyoming pine worn smooth and warm. 2 tall and 2 small, standing close enough that they were almost touching the way people stand when they've stopped being careful about showing that they need each other. That night after Rosie was asleep and Agnes was reading by the fire and Caleb was doing the last of the evening chores, Nora sat at the small desk in the yellow room and opened her mother's journal to the last blank page. She picked up her pencil and wrote, "Dear Mama, my name is Nora Rourke now. I wanted you to know. I wanted you to know we're safe, and we're together, and we're loved the way you always wanted for us." Rosie calls Caleb Papa Caleb, and she says it with the same certainty she says everything, like it was always true, and the rest of the world just had to catch up. "Agnes is teaching me more than I knew there was to learn. I'm going to be a healer, Mama, a real one. The kind you were before everything got so hard. I'm going to carry what you taught me, and I'm going to add to it, and someday maybe I'll pass it on to someone who needs it the way you passed it to me. I think about you every day. I think I always will, but I don't carry it the way I used to, like something that might crush me if I stopped bracing against it. I carry it the way you carried things, like something precious that's worth the weight. Uncle Warren is gone. He didn't appeal. I think he knew it wouldn't work, and I think he knew that we knew what he'd really come for, and I think that's the thing that actually shamed him, not losing, but being seen. I don't hate him. I don't have room for it, and I don't have the energy, and I think you'd tell me it's a poor use of the strength I need for better things. Rosie is happy, Mama. She is so happy it fills the whole house with it. She sings to the animals, and she argues with Agnes about the right way to braid hair, and she falls asleep at the kitchen table when she's supposed to be doing her letters, and she trusts completely and without reservation the way only a child who feels genuinely safe can trust. You gave her that. Even in the worst of it, you kept enough of the world from her that she still knows how to trust. That was the greatest gift you ever gave her, and I don't think you even knew you were giving it. I kept my promise. I kept her safe, and I kept us together, and I didn't stop. I don't think I'll ever stop. That's just how it is with us. But it's different now because I don't have to do it alone. I have people, real people who chose us and mean it and show up and stay. You didn't get that. Mama, and I'm sorry. I'm sorry the world wore you down before anyone could help carry it. But we got it. We got it because of you, because of the warnings you left, and the knowledge you gave me, and the strength you built into me on purpose, all those years of making me practice my stitches, and learn my herbs, and stand up straight, and speak plainly. You were preparing me for something you hoped would never come, and I hated it sometimes, and I understand it now. Thank you. For every single thing. For loving us so well for so long with so little. For not letting me see how scared you were. For writing it all down. I'll take care of her. I'll take care of all of them. That's who I am now, and I'm glad. All my love always. Nora Jean Rourke. She set the pencil down and closed the journal and sat for a moment with her hand flat on the cover, feeling the worn leather under her palm. The slight ridge of the spine, the weight of everything her mother had put into it, and everything she'd added herself. Then she put it back in the trunk at the foot of the bed, in the place she kept it safe and reachable, and went downstairs to sit with her family. Agnes looked up from her book when Nora came in. Caleb had come in from the barn and was adding wood to the fire, and the room was warm and smelled of pine smoke and the chamomile Agnes had been steeping. Rosie's boots were by the door in the crooked way she always left them, despite being told 100 times, and Butterscotch was asleep on the settle in the exact spot he'd been told not to sleep. Nobody moved to make room for her. They didn't need to. There was already room. Nora sat down beside the cat and looked at the carving on the mantel at the 4 figures standing close together in the lamplight, and she thought about the morning 2 months ago when she had pulled a threadbare quilt over her mother's still face and taken her sister's hand and walked out into a blinding Wyoming sun with nothing but a flour sack and a direction. She had walked toward smoke on the horizon because it was the only thing she could see to walk toward. She had knocked on a stranger's door because standing still meant dying. She had held her sister's hand through every step of it because that was what she'd promised, and she did not break her promises. And the stranger had opened his door, and another stranger had said yes to an impossible question, and a judge had listened to a dead woman's written words and a living child's spoken ones, and had chosen right over easy. None of it had been guaranteed. Every step of it could have gone differently. The world was full of doors that didn't open, and strangers who turned away, and judges who picked the wrong thing. Nora knew that. She would always know it. But this time against those odds, and because of choices made by people who didn't have to make them, it had gone right. Outside, the snow was falling steady and clean, covering the Wyoming ground in white, and making everything quiet the way snow always did, as though the world was being given a chance to start again. Inside, the fire burned, and the cat slept, and Agnes turned a page, and Caleb looked up from the fire, and met Nora's eyes across the room, with the steady gray-green gaze that had been the first thing she'd seen in him, and was still the truest. She had walked toward smoke on a desperate morning, with nothing to her name but her sister and her mother's journal, and a stubbornness that refused to become surrender. She had found something she had not known she was looking for. She had found people who chose her. And she had chosen them back with the same wholehearted certainty her mother had always told her to bring to things that mattered. They were not related by blood. They did not share a name by birth or a history by circumstance or a resemblance by nature. They were 4 people from 4 different losses who had found each other in the space those losses had carved out and had built something real in that space, something deliberate and durable and chosen every single day. The Rourke family. 4 people, 1 house, 1 fire, 1 future. Not perfect. Not without grief or difficulty, or the long work of learning to trust what you have while you still have it. But real. Completely, permanently, stubbornly real. Nora. Jean Rourke looked at the carving on the mantel and felt something settle in her chest with the finality of a door closing on everything that had tried to undo them, and she understood with the full clarity of a girl who had already lived more than most that this right here was what her mother had been fighting for all along. They had made it. All four of them, separately broken and together whole, they had made it home.